Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tom Banchoff. I'm Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown and Director of our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And on behalf of President DeGioia and the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Values, I'm delighted to welcome you to an extended conversation this afternoon under the heading, The New Social Covenant, Committing to Human Dignity and Common Values in the Global Economy. Just a little background before we jump into the topic. The Global Agenda Council on Values is a group of international thought leaders who meet annually under the auspices of the World Economic Forum. And earlier this year, the Council presented a document, the New Social Covenant that you have in front of you, at the annual meeting in Davos. This is very much designed as a living document. It's centered on three core values of human dignity, the common good, and stewardship of the environment, values critical not just for the global economy, but for world affairs more broadly. I said it's a living document. It's the object of ongoing consultations. In fact, we had a group of experts here yesterday and this morning to go into some of those themes in more detail. And this public event is part of that ongoing conversation. We look forward to engaging your ideas as we push forward with this agenda. This afternoon, you're going to hear from the main architects of the covenant, the council chair and vice chair, Mike Gerson and Reverend Jim Wallace. Mike will engage in a conversation with Deanna Farrell of McKinsey, and Jim will give our keynote with a response from Stuart Wallace of the New Economics Foundation. And between those two conversations, we're especially delighted to welcome Chelsea Clinton and President DeGioia, who will explore the themes of philanthropy as they relate to this document, the New Social Covenant. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge Michelle Mishler of the Forum for being with us for these conversations. We're delighted you can join us. Logistically, just a heads up, we're going to move straight through all three conversations without a break. That means we'll be covering a lot of ground within a relatively short time, but the program is designed to allow for conversation. About half the sessions will be up here on stage, and half the time will be devoted to conversation with you. My job will be to kind of keep things moving. With that, I'd like to call up our first two participants to the stage, Mike Gerson and Deanna Farrell, for a conversation on the topic business, values, and government regulation. And in the spirit of today's informal conversation, I'm going to keep the introductions brief. Mike Gerson is a nationally syndicated columnist who appears twice weekly in the Washington Post, as well as a well-known author. His most recent book is City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era, published in 2010. Mike also serves as senior advisor with the One Campaign. Deanna Farrell is co-founder of the McKinsey Center for Government, a leading center of expertise and innovation for the public sector. Before taking on her current position, she served as deputy director of the National Economic Council and deputy assistant on economic policy to President Obama. So please join me in welcoming Mike and Deanna.
Thank you. Let me start by adding my welcome and my thanks to Georgetown University for really its generosity in hosting this event. It's really been extraordinary. And let me add my thanks for the leadership of Jim Wallace on the Global Agenda Council on Values. He is really the guiding star of this project and of the New Social Covenant, which I think you have copies of that we hope you'll take a look at and react to in the course of these conversations. Our theory on the Council is pretty simple. Nations are being called upon to make some very difficult decisions about austerity, about scarce resources, about poverty and inequality, and those decisions will be based on values, whether they are conscious values or not. And we want to make those values conscious, considered, intentional, particularly at the World Economic Forum, and this meeting is part of that process. So if you read the document, you'll see an emphasis on issues of inequality and stalled social mobility. It's central to the argument that we're trying to make. Part of the document reads, "We have economies that are widely seen as unsustainable, unfair, unstable, and deeply unfulfilling. In addition, interclass mobility is now widely blocked, even in countries such as the US, which has always held hope to the dispossessed that they could lift themselves out of poverty through hard work. Today, it's my honor to interview one of the nation's leading experts on this set of issues, Deanna Farrell. Deanna was, as was mentioned, deputy director at the NEC under President Obama, and really one of the key economic advisors during one of the most difficult economic periods of modern history. She was at the center of the storm on regulatory reform, on auto industry restructuring, and the administration's broader economic response to the crisis. And currently she's at McKinsey, as mentioned, and thank you so much for joining us. This really is an honor for me. I'm interested in these topics, and there's no one better to address them. As a non-expert, let me start at the beginning. Even as we've seen the economy recover, we're still seeing high, even increasing levels of relative economic inequality, which also seems part of a long-term trend. And so let me just throw out, what are the causes? What are the group of contributing factors?
Thank you, and thank you again to Georgetown and to all of you for having me. One of the roles that I play is to be the vice chair on the Council on the Future of Government, where I think these questions are as important as they are to business and to citizens. But let me tackle your question this way, Michael. There's sort of one dimension of the problem, which is you can go back to the last 5, 6, 8 recessions, and you'll see a pattern, which is that you go through a period of disemployment, rise in unemployment, and that restores itself back to some level of structural reemployment. With every recession since the 1980s, we have had those downfalls in employment or unemployment be greater and greater, and the time to recovery longer and longer, and the newly found normal lower and lower. So that itself is a problem. This was a particularly brutal recession we just went through, but that is a general pattern that we've seen. So that's the context, one of the contexts that I'd say. There's inequality in the form of access to the economy that I think manifests itself in unemployment, particularly in youth unemployment, which we can come back to later. But linked to it and exacerbating it is the inequality question that you all are at the heart of. And here, I think that the economics field faces a terrible conundrum that has not really been put front and center. I think needs to be put front and center. If you go back as far as you want to go back, Industrial Revolution, et cetera, but maybe more interestingly for our purposes in a modern economy, to the post-World War II era, what you will see is that productivity, by which we mean the surplus generated by the number of inputs, increased, and in tandem, so did income. So did income per capita, and very importantly, so did hourly compensation, particularly wages. And so economists very happily and business people very happily said, you see, all we need to worry about is productivity and the generation of surpluses, because that's how nations prosper and that's how everybody prospers. And sure, there are winners and losers, but if we just sustain our focus on productivity, it will work out for world prosperity. Now, starting in about 1975, something very profound has happened, which is we have sustained very significant increases in productivity, but the increases in hourly compensation are not matching up to that. No. That is at the core of the inequality question. And this recession just made it worse. But mind you, this goes back to 1975. So just to put a fine note on it, if you look at the productivity increase from 1975 to today, or call it right before the recession, you had an 80% cumulative productivity gain. If you look at hourly compensation, wages, you had an 11% gain over that period of time. Now, that is a profoundly problematic issue for the economics field, because we have to say, wait, what happened? We always thought those were in tandem. We could worry about one thing. We could optimize one thing. Now, it's important to say, let's break that down a little bit. What explains that differential, that gap, that delinkage? The most important thing is the inequality within wage and compensation. And so for those people whose compensation is hourly compensation, and that, by the way, includes CEOs' hourly compensation as opposed to their options, as opposed to their others. A big part of this is the inequality within wages, which is a technology story, it's an automation story, but I would argue it is a societal tolerance story as well. There was a time when a CEO would have been embarrassed to make X multiples what the lowest paying person in his or her company did. And we've actually gone the other way as society. We extol these people. We celebrate the billionaires relative to the hourly, minimum wage worker dynamics. So I think technology is a big part of the answer. I think the skills-based economy is a big part of the answer, but I think there's a societal tolerance which is at the core of what this committee is trying to do. Second most important thing is the separation of, in economic terms, what's known as the terms of trade. So the production goes one path, but the things that people need to consume, particularly healthcare and education, have sort of outpaced inflation. So more and more of the compensation for people is going to pay for these services, and at a huge disadvantage. In most countries, healthcare and education are squarely a government agenda, which is why this issue links right back to what governments need to do one way or another. The last piece of this is the share of all productivity gain surplus that has gone to capital instead of labor. And this is at the heart of another theme you all raised, which is this, shareholder obsession, as opposed to a broader understanding of critical stakeholders in the picture. So I would argue that the issues you raised, Michael, that I think this paper raises, call them a trilemma of employment, and I would focus particularly on the youth unemployment issue, the income inequality, and then the even worse wealth inequality, which is linked to the income inequality, is really a profound challenge to traditional economic thinking. I have a theory of why that's true, but maybe you have a different question.
No, I want to hear the theory. I maybe drill down just a little bit on the role of developing human capital in responding to that problem.
Yep.
You have a report that you did where you make the point, unless the mass of American workers can develop new skills over the next 10 years, the nation risks another period in which growth resumes, but income dispersion persists.
That's exactly right.
So maybe you can talk about the role of human capital in responding to labor market trends, and how we should think about that and act on it.
Yep. Let me do that, but come at it in an important way, which I think is linked to the challenges of this human capital dimension, because it's not just skills in the classic sense, it's ability to operate in a broader system, being part of a broader societal system. So if I were to come back to the dilemma that I put forth and say, look, what's at the heart of a lot of this, or what should we be most concerned about? I would say is that we have gone from a view, and Sandler is particular at Harvard is particularly thoughtful in writing about these things, but we have come diverged from a view that I think is a very good view, which is a society that has a market economy, that uses the market economy as a tool to achieve things that it's trying to do, and particularly the organization of productive activity. Two, an economy that is a market society. We've gone from a society that has a market economy to a market society. And what that means is that everything has a price. Everything gets reduced to transactional value. Everything loses the social capital, the things that matter aside from money, things that matter aside. Now, in a world of inequality, that characteristic of a society stings even more, because the people who have less have even less access to things. It used to be that, people thought going to national parks was a perfectly good thing to do with your family vacation. Everybody went to national parks. Rich people went, poor people went. It was all part of the American experience. If you look at what's happening with national parks today, first of all, overall, nobody's going to national parks. And there's, a real distinction between the things you can buy, i.e. fancy trips and skiing and whatnot, and the things that you don't buy. And it's creating all kinds of senses of what people have and don't have, which undermines societal norms of all sorts. Now, your question was, okay, but how does the human capital, social capital, I would say the human and social capital are linked to that because so much of the provision of core services, of education, of daycare, childcare, communities minding all of what is entailed in raising children and raising their ability to operate in an increasingly complex world is not going to get reduced down to here's your voucher to go get a for-profit education system. Which I'm caricaturing, of course, but that's in effect kind of the dynamic that's at play. It's the complexity of developing the whole range of educational skills, the whole range of social capital skills is not, I don't think, conducively going to be achieved. A market society is not conducive to that outcome.
So how does a market society make up for that? Obviously, I mean, I'll quote back to you one more quote. It's like Meet the Press or something.
I better be careful, I've published a lot.
Yeah, rarely has the need for effective government been greater than now, and rarely has the ability to produce it been more constrained.
Right.
Yeah. So clearly you have to have some common action in the public good if your goal is to help equip people for a vastly different economy that's creating a new set of challenges. But the ability of government to act seems constrained. So I'm wondering what the sources of constraint are there. What are we seeing?
Well, let's start with just the demands on government for 1 second. The macroeconomic environment, the risk that now is inherent, whether it's the financial risk we saw through the crisis, the BP oil risk, the environmental risk we saw coming out of the BP oil spill, if we see, et cetera, has put the government under a much higher sort of responsibility for a whole set of macroeconomic and macro-societal issues. We've got demographic changes that are putting huge strains on governments, whether it's the aging of the developed world or the urbanization of the developing world. In almost every country, you've got sort of strains on that. You've got the evolution of technology that makes everybody want everything immediately, fast, tailored to me right away. Another demand on government. You've got the complexity of issues that government has to deal with, so that education is a health issue as much as it is an education issue, et cetera, governments have to respond to. And the list goes on. And you have governments that have, especially after the financial crisis, indebted themselves and created an atmosphere of distrust that makes it very difficult for them to increase taxes and to garner more of the resources of the economy to address those things. You've got real challenges in talent in government, attracting the right kind of talent to government. You've got natural resources constraints, whether it's air, water, energy, you name it. And again, the list goes on. And so you have this dynamic where the issues that are raised are facing governments, not the least of which are the ones we've put on the table so far, at a time when the tools government has are the least available or the most constrained. Our view on this is the only way you get out of that is through innovating, sort of changing how government does what it does, and ultimately building a lot more social trust in government, a lot more faith in government, which, as you've all seen, the polls is at its all-time low. At all-time low. It's just plummeted to single digits all over the world.
And that distrust doesn't just apply to government. It's
No.
to other institutions as well. Maybe you can talk about a little bit about how other institutions, market institutions, businesses, financial institutions, how do they recover trust in this environment?
Yep. Well, I think for a long time, and I think for a growing time, it's just sort of concomitant with the dynamic I explained after 1975, there became a sort of principle that was held and underscored, which is the business of business is business. The business of business is business. Which was really the shareholder argument. It's all about shareholder capital. And I think that ultimately, until businesses, and by the way, then people started saying, wait, that's not good enough. So they set up corporate social responsibility departments to kind of buy off a couple of people, make people a few happy. I'm being purposely difficult here. But until businesses, and I think the businesses that are doing this well, start to realize that this isn't, this is what you really do, and then by this on the side, we're going to do this little thing to appease our detractors. But what they understand it is core to the business of what they do, meaning a broader stakeholder alignment, a recognition that trust is not something you gain through branding, it's something you gain over long periods of time through actions that you take that ultimately suggest to people that you really do care about your consumers, you really do care about your employees, you really do care about society at large, and you care about the footprint you're creating on the environment as examples. And I do think that dialogue has begun in businesses, but it's not as widespread as we would like. I think there's still a view that, we're going to the World Economic Forum this week, so we should put on our hat and talk the good talk. But now we get back to business and do what we need to do. And until those are really, really brought into the boardrooms and into the right discussions, and as I say, we do have glimmers of hope because some companies are doing that more and more, but certainly not enough of them.
Well, I've selfishly gone over the time that I'm supposed to before we got to questions. And so I'd like to...
I think it was I went over.
No. It was very, very interesting material. But I would love to ask whether anyone has any follow-ups to this. Michael?
Oh, hi, it's Michael Elliott from the One Campaign, and thank you for a really clear and kind of very persuasive description of both of the problem and of how we might tackle it. So let me ask a provocative question too, though. What if the way in which the American and the broader North Atlantic economy developed in the 30 years after 1945, in the sort of golden age of social market capitalism, what if that was a fluke? What if the conditions that led to a linkage of productivity and earning power and family increased prosperity was a consequence of a whole range of social, economic, technological, and for that matter, geopolitical factors? I once wrote a book with that thesis that sort of created a happy but very, very difficult to repeat 30-year fluke.
I think I would argue that that is clearly true. I mean, at some point, it's evidently true that was a period of time that was no longer in play. And I think one has to ask a question of, well, could it be recreated again? Because we clearly don't have it now. And I think it can, and I think it will if we change the dialogue away from, as I just said, a market society, which we've become, to a society that uses the market as a tool for certain things. I think about, there have been periods that we can be optimistic about. For a long time, before we knew better, before government was sufficiently organized, businesses, in New York City would dump all their stuff right into the river. They would destroy it. And ultimately it was seen as though there's nothing anyone can do because that's just the only way we can create wealth. That's the only way we can drive incomes up. That's, how we're going to deliver jobs. And enough of a pull was to say, no, you know what? We can do that. And maybe on the margin we'll lower the immediate growth rates, but we're going to lower our current performance for a much broader health of the economy. And, you could swim in the Hudson River today. And I think there are parallels to that. I think in some ways we want to think of our society as we have allowed certain pollution to emerge because we're not paying attention. And we can take those levers back. We can use regulation wisely with a good sort of cost-benefit approach to achieve outcomes we want. We can address the climate change issues if we think about it as insurance against prospects of future growth and future prosperity. We have that capacity. We do, and it is a matter of not giving in to the notion that the only equity that matters here is the equity of the people who are putting up the capital. So I'm optimistic that there is a solution, that it can be changed, that it can be done. I am less optimistic about our governance structures today and our political process today, but I think that too can change. I think if we take it back, we can change it too.
Someone else? Yes, please.
Yes, let me add my thanks to Diana for the way you encapsulated the issues and from a business and economic perspective. Your last point about businesses have started but are only at the beginning phase to look at a broader responsibility. But how many businesses start up today that take a long-term view? Is that a problem?
It is a very big problem, and let me give you just a couple of interesting statistics to bring it home. The average tenure, if you think about how complex large companies are getting, and they really are. I mean, huge global footprints, very large workforces, et cetera. You would think that the time for just somebody to be able to get it and lead those companies would increase over time. It's done the opposite. So the average CEO tenure has gone from 10 years just 20 years ago to 6 years today. So even at the helm, the people who have the capacity to set in motion things that they might get to see, that window's narrowed. If you look at corporate boards, the percentage of shareholders who own a stock for X period of time, pick anything shorter than 2 years, has gone up dramatically. Which means that they're flipping, they're transactional. It's again this question of turning every relationship, every economic relationship into a transactional relationship, as opposed to saying it can play a role. It's a tool that we use. So I think this long-term orientation is very serious and very evident in the governance structures that I think need to change. And I think we should consider things like, should boards have, why do we have a one shareholder, one vote structure? Why don't we have people who are more committed to the long term of an institution have a weightier say in the outcomes of that institution? The way we think about boards of trustees, people who sit on trusteeships of universities, et cetera, they are all about the long term of the institution. And if you think of the institution as all its stakeholders, I think that's the direction we need to go. But I think it's challenged at the moment.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Colin, and I work here at Georgetown, and I just wonder if, as long as we're talking on values and honesty, values and trust, could you speak for a moment on the role of honesty in between the private sector, the public sector, and people in general, in terms of, it feels like not only do we not trust government, but maybe we can't even stand the truth were government to tell us the truth. So could you, I don't know, kind of play with that for a little bit?
That's an interesting question, the public tolerance for truth in this environment.
Yeah, that is a great question. That is a great question. And I think that in some senses, not to sound like a broken record here, but it does link back to the core thesis of what I'm saying, is that if you think everything is a contract, I mean, I love this shift you've made from a contract to a covenant, because I think it's right on point. Everything is, that the transaction of giving you what you want, then, I'm going to give you what you want. You want to hear that, oh, sure, we can, modernize, but not fire anybody. We can deal with our deficit and not deal with social benefits. We can deal with, I'm going to give you what you want because it's just a transaction until the next election. It's just and so I do think there's an element of, I would argue that in the regulation of industries, we have a similar dynamic, which is some of the obesity dialogue, some of the tobacco dialogue, which is, well, if that's what people want, we should give it to them. Well, maybe there are other norms than what people want and the transaction of that moment that should weigh in. So I do think your question of truth is linked to this notion of, well, I'm just going to give you what you want right now because this transaction we're going to. But I think that the bigger story that this links to is the story of trust. And trust in government, as you said, not just government, all institutions. And because in our work on the future of government, we have really focused on trust as an essential element of what government needs to focus on. We've given that some thought. And let me just share a few of these. I probably don't have time to go through all of them. But a lot of people talk about transparency. It is important that we have transparency. But what's important about it is not that, government puts out data sets on websites. It is that people, citizens, know and understand what's going on. And I think that speaks to your truth. It's a two-way street. Governments have to speak the truth, but the public needs to want to know and understand. And that engagement is too. There's a question of the resonance of what someone says, the fairness of what what government does and the dialogue that's taking place. And I think that our governance structures have devolved into I'm representing my stakeholders, my constituents, my whatever, and the hell with what's fair. That's a form of dishonesty too about the role that you're playing as a governance structure. So I think it's a more complicated issue, and I'm just cognizant of the time here. There are many elements of it, but I think if we move away from a notion that this is a transaction, I'm going to give you what you want, so you give me what I want, and we put other norms in place and hold people accountable to those norms, we have a better chance of it. But I do want to underscore that this government bashing, I am not a big fan of government bashing. I have enormous respect for the people who serve in government. When I was there, I was humbled by how hard people work, how committed they were to what they're doing. It's a three-way street between citizens, businesses, government, and everybody. There's plenty of blame to go around on this, and it's really around a covenant of everyone coming together to redefine the terms.
I had exactly that same experience when I was in government. I respected the people I worked with. I respected members of Congress who were individually very impressive. But there seemed to be structural or institutional constraints on this. Maybe, can you go into that just a little more from your time, and what you saw as the major obstacles to confronting some of this? I mean, I don't sense, we were having this discussion a little bit at lunch, but I go to South Korea or I go to other places. They have great urgency about social capital, and they act on it in very practical ways. Our political system doesn't seem to reflect some of that same urgency. But just curious about.
So longer conversation than we'll have time for, but let me offer two thoughts. The first one is that it's both the strength and the weakness of our system, the U.S. system, that that government was established here almost as a trustee of the status quo. So change is, by design, difficult in our government system. Lots of checks and balances. One person can say no, but 100 people have to say yes. So on and so forth. And when you thought that societies were relatively static, and even in the days of our founding figures, things had started to change, but not that rapidly, you probably thought that was a good thing. For stability of government, you don't want lots of change. I think as we find the kind of compression of change and the cycles of change, that has not served us as well. And so the barriers to potential change are great. And that's sort of, I could give you so many examples of that, even in the middle of financial crisis, even in the middle of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, where you'd think the sense of urgency was as high as it will ever be. Just the slowness with which, and I think that was structural to the way we are designed. I think the second part, and I think this is a contrast to a lot of governments around the world, because we work with governments all over the world, and I see this contrast too, is we have an executive branch, but we do not have executive decision-making in our government. CEOs are executive decision makers. They they still have to worry about their stakeholders, but ultimately they can make a decision, and then that decision will be executed on in a pretty direct way. That's simply not true about what happens in government. And I think it was a very humbling thing serving the president to realize that even the president of the United States is quite constrained on what he or she can do at any point in time. Just the realities of the combination of laws and stakeholder groups and civic groups and everything else. And on the one hand, as I said, it's the strength and it's the weakness. We do have a vibrant democracy. Not everyone sees the world the same way, and those cross currents have to be contended with. But other countries who have a greater ability to have executive function in the classic sense, I think can get more serious about these things. Now add the complication, which is our federal versus state versus local, and then you get sort of a very intractable problem, particularly on the education and healthcare fronts, where I think other countries do make, we have in some ways the best education system, but but in terms of making improvements, other countries are much better.
Please.
Rob Wilson-Black, Sojourners. A question about Simpson Bowles. So a couple nights ago at the archives, you have senators, Simpson Bowles, a couple of multi-billionaires gathering to talk about fixing the debt long term. And one theme came out, and that is sort of the great woman, great man theory of history. We need a leader to drive us through this like Moses or something. And the other one was, no, the people are not ready for that. They need to rise up and create that great leader. So they seem to be stymied, and in addition to being frightening to watch multi-billionaires, senators, and intellectual minds not be able to even come to the end of an evening some way forward. What do you make of that? The great woman theory of history, the people not ready for leadership in big issues like that you've dealt with?
I think almost any change, anytime you look at change, true change, you will see maybe not the great leader, but you will see great leadership of multiple people, and often under the banner of a person who can be the flag carrier for a lot of people who are playing that role. And I think that where there's almost no change you can point to that has been good and transformative to society that hasn't come with people sort of being flag bearers that have had support behind them. So I would underscore the importance of leadership. But I think that to go from there to the caricature of the great man or great woman story, which says, regardless of anything else that was going on, they would have persevered. I think even some of our biggest heroes, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, other people who the odds were so much against them, they were sitting on the shoulders of people before them, and the context was right. So I think the sort of seemingly lazy, but I don't think it is lazy answer, is it's really both. You need the leadership. Leadership is essential to change. But the conditions have to be sufficiently right. And I think an aspect of leadership is understanding that you have to enable the conditions. Otherwise, you just have, quixotic quests for change, which just don't go anywhere.
Who's next? John?
2 days ago, the report came out that poverty remained at 25 million people, 15%, much higher percentage of children. Almost no commentary, not a word from our leaders. Today, the Federal Reserve decides that it's going to continue to keep investing to keep the stock market going up. That will, if not lead the evening news, it'll follow the reports of the shooting here. Why the deafening silence on poverty? Why so little from our leaders, so little from economics and our other institutions?
I think this is a very tragic situation, really, that we are such a prosperous nation, that we are so endowed with so much, and that we stand by when anybody, frankly, but when so many have so little, and especially when we're such a wasteful society in so many ways. So I wish I had a good answer to you, and I think all I can come back to is what I think your group is trying to do, Michael and Jim, which is to force that dialogue, which is, if we had a family of someone who was destitute, you would not leave them out on the street. And we've got to sort of enhance our concept of a society to say, okay, of course we can't have a 300+ million family, but we certainly can approximate more of that sensation that we're all in this together in a critical way, and that is a shame on us that other people live like that. And I think until we undermine that it isn't just like, oh, I can just go to my house in Northwest DC and ignore what's happening, even in this very city, where it's a shame on me that I live in a city, that I'm willing to tolerate living in a city where we have the poverty rates that we do. I think until we make that part of what we solve for as a society, we're not going to get there. And I think that the efforts to change the dialogue are part of it. I think, sadly, what has happened in our political system is that we have enabled sort of esoteric anti-government agenda. Ultimately, governments are the only refuge for the destitute, for the people who have no other representation, the children who have no parents who can take care of them, et cetera. We've turned the anti-government agenda ultimately into anti-poor people agenda. And I think that's a very dangerous thing for our society. But I think the solution has to be in unwinding that, to recognize that the government is us at the end of the day. We are, and to the extent that we're not providing for our society as a whole, shame on us.
I'd only add, as a former speechwriter, we've had over the last few decades the triumph of middle classism in American politics. Political elites just talk about the middle class, and that's true across the spectrum. I mean, you go to the Republican convention, I was on the floor in a lot there, they talk about entrepreneurs and, almost exclusively, as though most Americans are not entrepreneurs. But you go to the Democratic convention, it's middle class all the time. It leaves a set of issues really unaddressed in our politics. And so it is a huge gap. You just don't hear much political discourse on the issue.
As an economist, there's a very easy explanation, right? Which is even think about at the peak of unemployment during this crisis, we were sort of just north of 10% unemployment. And you'd say, how could we accept that? Like, how is that possible that we're going to, some countries have much higher unemployment rates, but we had not in a very, very long time experienced that kind of unemployment. And the simple sort of rational behavioral answer is, well, 90% of the labor force does have jobs. So if you're a politician for votes, who are you going to worry about? And same thing with the foreclosure story, same thing with the poverty story, same thing with the others. And so I think it's only when we link the plight of those people to what's happening to the bulk of people that we have a chance of making it the agenda that it needs to be.
I think we have time here for another question.
Those were good questions.
Yeah, they were. Maybe I can just close with one. Maybe ask you just to elucidate a little more on the education issue. Which is central to all this. But it seems like whenever we have a national debate on these issues, it's singularly ideological and unproductive. We're debating a Common Core right now in the United States, and it's become deeply polarized, even dominated by conspiracy kind of theories. And it seems like that's a particularly unproductive debate. How do we get out of that morass? I think it's so essential.
So I think that we are getting out of that morass. I'm actually more optimistic on education than I've been in a long time. And I think the kernel of hope is the kind of efforts that have been undertaken since the OECD established the PISA scores, for example, since we've started articulating a set of metrics that are allowing us to have a dispassionate and less ideological discussion about what works and what doesn't work. And so, we talk about, we need to move from policy-based evidence making, which means I like this policy, so let me go find the evidence that proves my point, to evidence-based policy making. And I think in education, we are starting to see that. I think the debate in the United States has changed profoundly. You've got a Democratic administration that is promoting school reform, that is behind charter schools. That is a profound shift if you think about it. And I think
Race to the Top was a real break.
Was a real break. And I think part of it was that we now have a set of benchmarks, painful as it was to get people to focus on, that are driving a different discussion. And we see this outside of the U.S. all over the place, where people are saying, look, everyone knows Finland has the best education system in the world. It's not helpful for me to tell you that if you're Pakistan. Pakistan is not going to become a Finland tomorrow, but it is helpful for me to say, here are the 500 interventions that we know work. Which ones can you start implementing now that have some chance of having real impact? And so the conversation is not the ideological one that is, not grounded in any real reality of either observable outcomes or interventions that have precedents, et cetera. So I think that's the answer. And we didn't get to the government part of all this, but I do think that where I have a glimmer of hope about government going forward, we see a lot of push in this direction of getting credible metrics, getting good benchmarks to drive an understanding of why is it that some people are performing well and others are not. We're getting really good behavioral economic thinking into policymaking, which says, let's try something, get a feedback loop, fix it. Try something, get a feedback loop, fix it. So we're not trying to sell it ideologically. We're really working on what works. We just keep doubling down on what works, and we stop doing things that don't work. As one element, I think that's critical to solving the education issue. And as I said, I'm maybe a little more optimistic than I've been, although it's only when I look at the improvement possibilities and maybe not so much at the levels and outcomes at the moment, because they're still pretty atrocious.
Well, that may be a good place to end on the moral value of excellence in the provision of core services. I don't think people usually think in those
Right,
terms, that
right.
that in fact is a moral commitment to provide services
Yes,
that work for
yes,
people.
yes.
And that those reform efforts are essential to this. It's not just having the right motivation.
Right. And
being
essential
rigorous,
ultimately to the reestablishment of trust in institutions.
Right.
Right.
Well, please join me in thanking Deanna.
Thank you all. Those were great questions.